many top swimmers, but there was one young man who learned to swim at the Y and became an undefeated diver. Now, it's one thing to swim. It's another thing as a young black teenager in the 50s and 60s to be undefeated in the state.
Well, today's conversation is special for me because my guest and I go back more than a decade. Dr. Jeanne Nutter was one of the first people to encourage me when I first stepped into college education. She inspired hundreds of communication students with her lessons on media, history, and the power of storytelling. After retiring from teaching, Jeanne didn't stop educating. She simply found a new classroom through her books and films that highlight Black history in Delaware. Her latest work, Images of America, Walnut Street, YMCA, and YWCA, captures a vibrant chapter of Wilmington, Delaware's African American community. It was a time when this building wasn't just a place to gather, but a beacon of culture, civil rights, and community pride. I'm really thrilled to sit down with Dr. Nutter to talk about her journey, the stories behind her book, and why preserving our shared history matters now more than ever.
20 years ago, I did my first Arcadia book, and it went really well. It was a pictorial history of African Americans in Delaware. It's still being published. Can you believe it was? No, it's 25 years because it was in 2000. And then the following year, I was working on these documentary films, and there was information that I wanted to get. So I did a book of oral histories, which is still in print and people are still buying. And so I thought, the Walnut Street Y was such an important institution during segregation, and it's still going, but not in the same configuration that it was from 1940 to the 1970s. And my father had I was in the ballet program. My father had photographs. I had photographs from the other two books. And I had worked with the Delaware Historical Society, knew they had a little bit. And I went to the Walnut Street Y and said, do you have any photographs? Well, the people that are working there now had no idea of the history. And they said, yeah, we got some, there's a box in the basement. I said, in the basement? So they brought up this box. I got acid-free folders and gloves and went through. And then there was a woman who had been very active in the YW, and she had passed, but I contacted her sister, and she said, yes, Barbara has photographs, and she had a wealth. She was really into African American history. So I then worked to try to put it all together. And that's how, but I felt that the history was going to get lost because most of the people that worked there have died. They would be 100 years old. My father was on the board. He'd be 100 plus, and a lot of other people who were dead. So I just said, you need to try to capture that now. Before it's all lost, and so that people can find it. And also, Black YMCAs were across the country. And the swimming pool, the dormitories, those kinds of things were in all of them. So I felt that people would find it interesting in Delaware, but they might also find it interesting in Virginia Beach, in Philadelphia, in DC, because the way the Ys were set up were similar. In fact, someone said, oh, Jeanne, I took ballet at the Y, and they didn't live in Delaware. So there were similar kinds of activities that happened. And that's why I decided to do it.
Can you explain for maybe other
Yeah.
people to understand, because why the way the dynamic of the YWCA, the Black
Yeah.
YWCAs
Yes.
was not the way I grew up. When I grew up, YWCA was for everybody. You know,
Yeah.
it was not a segregated situation. Can you
Yes.
talk about that a little bit?
Okay. So you said YW. This was basically the YM. They had the YW. The Walnut Street Y was the only YMCA, YWCA combined for a while. Eventually, because the YW has always been very progressive, the Black YW merged with the white YW. In fact, as a child, one of the day camps I went to was with the white YWCA. Okay, so I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but the YWCA early on in the early 1900s was doing workshops on race. Okay, the YM wasn't, the male section was not, but the YWCA has always been progressive, integrating Black women and women, Native Americans and whatever. But the YMCAs were segregated. And so within blocks of the YMCA, the Black YMCA was the white YWCA, where you could not stay nor participate. So that's the way it was in most places. I even think in New York on 135th Street is a YMCA, and that was the Black YMCA. I don't know whether Blacks could go to the white YCA, but the Harlem YMCA had been a very vibrant Y for a very long time. So I'm not sure what happened in some other northern cities, but I think that pretty much so they were segregated.
Wow. What was the most powerful discovery that you made in looking at through all the history and the pictures that you found? There was a lot there, but is
Yes.
there a few that really stood out for you?
Okay. What really stood out for me was in the front of the building were friezes, sculptural images of Black people. Now, as a child, I looked up and said, great, oh, we have Black people on this building, and it made you feel proud. What I realized was that the friezes on the front of the Y were the only sculptural representations of Black people in Delaware.
Hmm.
There was Caesar Rodney and Rodney Square, there were other military people, but there were no images, public art. Okay, there was no public art of Black people in Delaware until I think the late 60, early 70 in Peter Spencer Square. So people saw these, but it wasn't until I did the research that I found out who they were. And someone just came to me recently at a book signing and said, I didn't realize Marian Anderson was depicted on the front of the building. So there was Marian Anderson, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Paul Robeson,
Mhm.
and Richard B. Harrison. Richard B. Harrison was in Green Pastures on Broadway and was on the cover of Time magazine in the 30s. Now, all of the people depicted in the front of the building were popular in the 1930s. I was surprised that the person who did these, I always thought a Black artist did these. No, a white artist did these, which meant he was studying African Americans, prominent African Americans in the 30s.
If you're enjoying this conversation and it's sparking something in you, maybe a memory or a reminder of how powerful our stories can be, please take a moment to subscribe. It's free. Subscribing helps keep more people discovering conversations like this one and keeps the color between the lines growing so we can continue amplifying voices that deserve to be heard.
Augusta Savage did a sculpture called Lift Every Voice and Sing in the 1939 World's Fair. It was done in plaster, so it's no longer available, but it looks like a harp, but a harp made of African American bodies. It's a wonderful, and Augusta Savage was a wonderful artist, well known, and that piece. So I think that it was Augusta Savage that he used as a model. There's also athletics and it's track. Well, Jesse Owens won in the 1930s. So I think that he probably was using Jesse Owens as the model because everything was the 1930s. Now, what is interesting is the person who came up to me said, I didn't know Marian Anderson had a Delaware connection. The Delaware connection is that her husband, Orpheus Fisher, spent time in Delaware. The Fisher family was a prominent Black family in Delaware. And so Marian Anderson came to Wilmington often to spend time with the Fisher family.
Wow.
So, that part to me was really exciting. And I felt it gave African American history to people. And when I talked to people, they said, Jeanne, until I read your book, I had no idea who the people were. And because the images were high up, as little kids, you looked up and you said, oh, those are Black people in kind of prominent positions, and it made you proud, but you had no idea who they were. And so I think it was interesting that Booker T. Washington was on the same panel as George Washington Carver, because George Washington Carver worked at Tuskegee where Booker T. Washington was president. So I'm telling you, the sculptor really did his homework in putting this all together. Now, the second thing that was amazing as I did this was the swimming program. Okay. Blacks basically had no public swimming pools except for the Y. And that was the same in Delaware. There was an outdoor pool called Cruce's Pool, but that was outdoor, which meant in the winter, you couldn't participate in. Okay. So you got the Y pool. Well, you ended up with first class swimmers. Now, we don't think of, especially back in the 50s and, you know, the 40s and the 50s, of African Americans being that great in swimming. Now we do. But they had really top swimmers, but there was one young man who learned to swim at the Y and became an undefeated diver. Now, it's one thing to swim. It's another thing as a young Black teenager in the 50s and 60s to be undefeated in the state. He learned to swim at the Y. The man's name is Lafayette Jackson. He ended up going to high school and was the only African American on the swim team, but the undefeated diver on this white swim team.
Wow. Wow.
He then went on to Howard University and was undefeated as a diver. I constantly say to everybody in Wilmington, we need to know the name Lafayette Jackson. And Lafayette ended up graduating from college, getting a master's, and working in New York for, I think he worked for Avon, and then he worked for Black Enterprise and other places. So he had an illustrious career, but I mean, to think as a diver, it was absolutely amazing. And there were other people. There was another man who grew up in the Y, ended up in track. Now, he didn't learn track at the Y, but he credits the Y for developing his early athletic prowess. And he ended up breaking records in track in high school and then at Morgan State in the 60s, then became a teacher, became an award-winning coach in high school. And then the Philadelphia Phillies said, hey, come work with the team. I mean, as in addition to what he was doing. So you find that the Y provided a foundation for some really outstanding human beings. And these are only a couple of the people.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how important that hub was. You know,
Okay.
it seemed like when you go back in history, how churches were such a major part of Black American culture, and
Yes.
how it was a connection with everyone. So
Yeah.
how was the YMCA and YWCA, this particular location, how was it connected to the community?
Okay. I'm glad you asked that question because, yes, you had your churches. The ministers from all of those Black churches were involved with the Y. They were on the board. They chaired committees. Some churches actually had services at the Y because they had an auditorium. The NAACP met there. What I saw early on and learned that some of the early leaders in the Y were members of the Masons. So the Masons were involved. So the Y brought every organization and institution, the schools, one of the schools gave the Christmas pageant every year. And then the high school had an internship kind of program. And one woman, Doris Cannon, did an internship in high school at the Y. And one of the administrators at the Y came to her house and said, we want you to come as a secretary. That's how much the Y was integrated into the community. And there's a picture in the book of the Y board. My father's in the picture. But on the first row is a man named Dr. Joseph Johnson, who was one of the first principals at P.S. DuPont High School. He now has a school named after him. That's how prominent he was. Then there was a man named Calvin Hamilton, who was the first African-American architect in Delaware. Dr. Eugene McGowan, who was the first African-American school psychologist. Reverend Maurice Moyer, who was president of the Wilmington NAACP for 5 years. So all of these people are on the front row.
Wow.
Okay. And there are other people in business and whatever. So if you had any professional standing in the community, you were on the board. However, you did not only have to be professional, because some of the most prominent leaders in the Y were butlers or chauffeurs for wealthy white people. Now, looking at photographs of them, you would not be able to distinguish them from the PhDs or the architects, but that tells you something about the Black community. We know that in the churches, people who have high-level positions could be maids or chauffeurs, and the same thing in the Y. And so the Y brought everyone under the tent to be leaders and other people. And that was the same for the YWCA. So I just did oral interviews. We're trying to do a film, and we got a grant. The Y got a grant, but now a lot of money has been cut from where we usually go. But I interviewed some people and they talk about the importance. In fact, Lafayette Jackson said until he came to the Y, he had only seen people in suits at church. So, but at the Y, the executives all wore, back in the 50s and 60s, they wore suits and ties to work. So there were role models to young Black kids, and the women wore dresses and suits, if you'll notice the pictures. So they were role models for young Black kids. And one of the people that's in the book, in fact, he and his brother, it's Lloyd and Floyd Casson, they were the only people that I know that, Floyd Casson is dead, but Lloyd is, I think, 90 or 91 years old. He was like 4 years old when the Y opened and he was there with relatives. But he went through the Y from like age 4 and he participated as an adult. He said it was a place where you were loved and felt cherished. And that's what you get from people, that this was a place that loved you and cherished you and wanted you to be the best that you could be. And that's why I felt I needed to document it, because it was a loving place. And even though people would scold you, it was because they wanted you to do your best. No, it was a great place.
That's very familiar in
Yeah,
terms of my own background. I know I have to ask you this because
yeah,
we go back a long way. And
yeah.
when you retired from teaching, did you imagine that you'd be doing this kind of work? It would morph into writing books and producing oral documentary histories and all that?
No, well, I had started a little before I retired, but I had no idea that I'd be doing as much. Yeah.
Are you having a good time doing this? Was this transition easy or was it a
It,
little difficult?
no, it wasn't difficult. And it wasn't difficult because before, when I did some of the films, I was teaching, doing caregiving, and now I'm retired. It's a little easier. My house will look a wreck because you'll have papers and photographs. When I was working on the book, people said, "Can I come by?" I said, "Not yet." When the book is finished, I said, because I have photographs laid out and things all over the place, and it's kind of crazy. But I love this work. I really do.
I have to ask because I forgot to ask at the beginning because we just kind of like went off on a roll.
Yeah,
But you for years have been a teacher,
yeah,
and it was a passion of yours. What
yeah,
was that? And so many students had come up to me and say they loved you and your teaching and how you inspired them
yeah.
to to do what they wanted to do in communications. Was it always a connection between communications and history for you? Was that your passion and that's what drove you to teaching, or what was that made you pursue that area before you became deep in the historical, archives?
Well, it's interesting. I was a child of the 60s. So in college, I was involved with Black theater in the community because the theater at the University of Cincinnati didn't have roles for, okay, basically. And so I got very much involved in Black theater, but I also liked African American literature. So I ended up going into schools doing during Black History Month, reading Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, a lot of other people, performing poetry. People, because my parents were in Delaware and I was back and forth, a Black teachers sorority said, "We'd like for you to do Black literature in the schools for us." So for several years, I would come to Wilmington during Black History Month, and they would have me go. They had a Black History project where kids would have to do, classes would have to do, I think, a Black History scrapbook. And I would go to maybe 10 schools. And I'd go to like 3 or 4 a day. I mean, I would have a container of lemon and hot lemonade with honey. And I do these little performances with kids, and they'd be interactive. And I'd go from one school to another school. The newspaper actually covered me. They did articles on me uh, doing this. But I have to tell you, when I was at the University of Cincinnati and I was going around to schools, my first job when I graduated was with the Girl Scouts. And I ended up in the administrative role in the Girl Scouts. And I started doing, as a part of my work, going into schools, doing Black literature in schools. And Red Book magazine came to the University of Cincinnati and said they were looking for an interesting woman to cover. I was chosen, and they followed me in the schools doing this interactive work with kids, and an artist sketched me. So the article in Red Book, and it was in the beauty section, okay, had drawings of me doing interactive poetry work with kids. They did, well, first of all, he did photographs. The artist did photographs. And then he took the photographs and did drawings of me. and did drawings with the kids. It was amazing. So, I mean, my life has had some interesting twists and turns, but I've been doing Black literature and sort of history for a long time, even before I did teaching. I didn't start out expecting to do college teaching. I was working with Henry Street Settlement, doing multicultural work that had to do with African Americans, Latinos, the Puerto Rican, the Chinese community, and the Jewish community, and said, I like this. I think I want a PhD. Went to Howard, which, hey, it's the Mecca, and I'm interested in Black history and culture, and it all sort of melted together. And I had gotten uh, Compton, uh, fellowship, Danforth Compton Fellowship, and it was for you to teach. I didn't particularly want to teach, but I thought they invested in me to teach. So I said, okay, I needed to pay back, you know, because they paid for my PhD. And so I started teaching at William Patterson and went. But even then, I was just going to do it for a couple of years and then do something else. So that's my story.
I tell you.
It's
Wow.
been a bit crazy. It's been crazy.
In a way, it's like you created your own job. In
Yeah.
many ways, that's
Yeah.
what a lot of the young people are doing today. They have to think outside the box and think
Yeah.
about their passion
Yeah.
and figure out where they fit and make
Yeah.
it work. And
Yeah.
that's what you did. And then it just kind of blossomed into something else and into
Yeah.
something else and into something else.
And there's something I forgot to tell you, because my life has been crazy. I mean, I tend to do what I like to do, which I probably could have been richer if I had done a linear kind of path. But when I was doing my PhD, when I got to the dissertation stage, um, I decided to do an internship at the United Nations, but I got my PhD, was working on my PhD in my mid to late 30s. So I was older, I had worked already. So I go to the UN, and I'm in the training division called UNITAR, the United Nations Institute of Training and Research. And the director of training said, hey, listen, I know this is an internship, but I'd like to hire you because you have skills after the internship is over. So I said, bet, I'm going to be at the UN, right? Um, and so there was a trip to Bhutan, a training trip, and the director, Dr. Schwebach, Werner Schwebach, said, Jeanne, would you like to go to Bhutan? I said, bet, I'd love to go to Bhutan. So I'm all ready to go to Bhutan, and Dr. Schwebach decides he wants to go instead. So I'm disappointed. But God had something better in store. SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, was like in South Africa, the revolutionary arm with Mandela. This was like that for Namibia, which was neighboring South Africa and controlled by South Africa. So they were training SWAPO chief representatives because Namibia was still under South African rule at this point. So the SWAPO chief representatives were the representatives of SWAPO throughout the world. So there was a conference in Zambia, in Lusaka, and they sent me to go to work with these people who had been revolutionaries. Okay.
Wow.
So I'm in a room with people who have fought for the liberation of their country, and we're now representing it. Okay, so we do this. It's over. If I leave the UN because it was the USSR and the United States decided they weren't going to fund the UN. So the man who wanted to hire me had to leave UNITAR and go back to Germany. And I really liked UNITAR. So I ended up at NYU in a race desegregation assistant, again, dealing with multicultural kinds of things. But what was interesting was years later, I decided to look up some of the people. I was going to an academic conference. I was at Bloomfield, decided to say, you're going to South Africa, why don't you look up some of the people in Namibia that, you know, this was 20 years ago, but maybe they'll remember you. Emailed 2 people. One man said, when you come, call my secretary and I will take you. So I go to Namibia, call his secretary. He has me in his office and says, Jeanne, I think I'm going to become president of the country. Okay.
Wow.
I go back to my hotel. There's a message that he had arranged dinner for me with other African-American women who had married SWAPO folk and were living. So he arranged, I mean, here's this man with this high level organizes a dinner for me with these Black women who had been living in Namibia. Okay. So I go, he says he's going to be president. Several years later, I Google, he became president of the country. I have a picture posed with him. I mean, you can't make this up. This is my life. No money, but plenty of experience. And I looked him up recently and he had died, but I got to know him and spend time. I mean,
Yeah.
And so in making your own world and making my own world, I've had unbelievable experiences, absolutely, and met places. I was in spaces I shouldn't have been in, you know?
Well, you should have, because God knows what you're supposed to do.
Yeah,
What would be your advice to a student or a person who's young, who's running into something that they never thought would be,
yeah.
offered to them? And what would be your advice, since you've gone and done so many different things?
I would say go for it. If something is interesting to you, try it and be inquisitive. I always, when I was young, when I was in college, I said, I don't care how old I get to be, I always want to be inquisitive. I always want to be adventurous. And even now, I will risk it. People will say, you did that? I said, yeah, I saw this and I wanted to go here. I was an exchange student to Germany when I was 16 for a summer. I'm still close with that family. In fact, I was just in Berlin last month. And now I'm friends with my friends' children and their grandchildren. It's amazing that we've had a lifelong relationship. When I was 16, I didn't think I thought for several years we'd be connected, but never thought that I have that kind of lifelong connection. And when I applied, I had an aunt who always wanted me to be an exchange student, but I had turned 16, and that summer I wanted to be with my friends and the parties, and I get this note. that I'm going to Germany. And I was like happy on one hand, but going, oh, shucks, all these things I was planning to do with my friends back in Wilmington, Delaware, glad I didn't.
So where can people find your documentary that is on its way and your book?
Okay, the books are at Arcadia's website, Barnes and Noble, and Amazon. So any of those places you can get the book. My last two films, which were with Hagley Museum and Library, were on African Americans in the sciences. One is Dr. Wesley Meminger Jr., Science into Art. It's on YouTube. And the last one I did is Dr. William Bazell, Science and a Life of Science and Service. His is very interesting. Dr. Meminger's is interesting because he worked for DuPont and worked on Kevlar, was one of the sciences, but he was also a fine artist. So the film talks about his work as a scientist, but also as an artist. And I interviewed him at the right time. He died a year ago. And he began to have some memory issues and some other issues. So his wife always says, Jeanne, you interviewed him at the right time. And when we finished the film, like a year later, the Delaware Art Museum did a retrospective of his art and had the film as a companion piece. So that made me feel really good. That they did this. And then the last film that I did, which came out in April on Dr. Bazell, traced his family's history in African American education in Arkansas. His family helped to develop schools. It's amazing. I had no idea. But Dr. Bazell has been a lifelong Kappa and has done a lot of work with young Black men. They built a building, and I mean, it's amazing. So his life is interesting. So that's why we talk about a life of science and service. And he also was on the board of a STEM program in Delaware. That started out in the 1970s that his uncle at Texas Southern helped to establish.
Well, Dr. Jeanne Nutter has been a lifetime giving voice to untold Black histories, from her years as an educator to her remarkable work as an oral historian and author. Her new book, Images of America, Walnut Street, YMCA, and YWCA, reminds us that even in the era of segregation, communities built spaces of joy, empowerment, and connection. Jeanne, thank you for your dedication to preserving our stories and for continuing to teach us in your own powerful way why they matter. I'm Esther Dillard, and this has been The Color Between the Lines. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen or watch. And remember, your story matters.